Hello, crafty friend, and welcome back to my channel. I'm Adrienne of Alice Scraps Wonderland. Today, I'm going to be sharing a very different kind of project. I've been exploring using stamps to make embroidery patterns, and I wanted to share my process for creating this beautiful magnolia embroidery using the new sizzix Willow Wolf collection. I'll share how to stamp out your pattern using multiple stamps to create a single cohesive image, how to transfer it to your fabric, as well as some of my embroidery process. So let's get right into this tutorial. Today, I'll be using the Willow Wolf Magnolia stamp set from sizzix to create my pattern. I'll also be using the sizzix registration press, some white cardstock, light pink fabric, a 9-inch embroidery hoop, embroidery needles, a heat erasable pen, embroidery floss, some cutting tools, black archival ink, plus a few other miscellaneous supplies. I'll have all of the supplies used listed in the description box below for you with links to shop. Start by tracing out the inside of your embroidery hoop onto the white cardstock to set the parameters for your design. Then place the cardstock onto the sticky grid of the registration press tool. I'm starting out with the largest magnolia stamp in the set and place it off to the center right of the circle, then pick it up with the lid of the registration press tool. I like to remove the lid to add ink to the stamp, then place the lid back into the hinge and press it onto the paper. The beauty of this tool is that if you don't get a perfect impression the first time, or you just need it darker, you can re-ink your stamp and press it back in as many times as you like, as long as you don't remove the stamp from the lid. The lid is what keeps the stamp perfectly placed each and every time. If you want, you can also use a stamp press tool to help you get more even pressure when stamping. Once you are happy with the impression, leave the stamp on the lid and place some of Scrapbook.com's 4-inch mint tape over the magnolias. Make sure that the left side is completely covered. If the right isn't covered, that's okay here. Again, ink your stamp and press it down to create a print on the mint tape. Pull up the tape and place it on a self-healing craft mat if you plan to use a small craft knife. I think a craft knife will be much easier than a small pair of scissors due to the sticky nature of the mint tape. Fussy cut out the left side of this stamped image. If you are enjoying this tutorial, don't forget to give this video a like and to hit the subscribe button for more content like this. Once it's cut out, line it back up with the image on your cardstock and press the tape into place nicely. This will become a mask for us to add additional stamped images. I ended up tearing my mask halfway up and realigning just the top half to make it easier on me to get this on perfectly. Now that the mask is in place, add the butterfly and magnolia branch to your cardstock. Place the branch so that it overlaps the mask and the butterfly so it overlaps the circle. Remove the large magnolia stamp from the lid of your tool and then pick up the other 2 stamps with the lid. Ink the stamps and press them onto the cardstock. Once you are happy with the impressions, remove the mask from your cardstock and the cardstock from the registration press. Our pattern is now complete. To clean your stamps, use a stamp chamois with some water. Now, let's get into transferring the image to fabric. You can totally iron your fabric with a regular iron, but I wanted to show that you can also do it with the spray bottle and the Cricut Easy Press. I'm using the mini version here. I don't worry about getting the folds out completely since this fabric will be stretched taut in the embroidery hoop. Then I place the hoop over the ironed fabric on a self-healing cutting mat and use a rotary blade to trim down the fabric. This makes it easier to use some pinking shears. Pinking shears serve to keep the fabric from fraying as I work on stitching. Before transferring the pattern to the fabric, I just want to darken the circle on the pattern as I'll be adding this to help me get the fabric centered in the hoop. I'm just going over it with a permanent marker. I tape my pattern to a light pad using some washi tape and then center the fabric over it. I use some marble coasters to help weigh down and hold the fabric in place as I transfer the pattern. I'm using a heat erasable pen. This ink disappears when you apply heat to it, such as with a heat tool or iron. I love these pens because you don't have to worry about your stitching covering up your pattern lines perfectly. Now, I'm by no means an embroidery expert. In fact, this is only my 6th embroidery project. But if you are new to embroidery, my biggest tip for transferring patterns is to do short strokes with your pen. You don't want the pen dragging on the fabric, as this will cause the fabric to pull and stretch, distorting your pattern on the fabric. Now you can also see that even though the circle went through the butterfly wing, I did not draw that part of the circle that overlaps with the butterfly onto the fabric. And you may also find it helpful to look at the stamp or the art on the stamp set box to help make sure you are getting your lines correct. Sometimes it can be hard to see through the fabric. I also simplified the lines in the butterfly on the fabric after doing a few strokes and realizing it was way too much detail. Perhaps if you were to use only a single strand of floss, you could have more detail, but I wanted to use my typical 3 strands of embroidery floss here. Once the pattern is transferred, you can place it into your embroidery hoop, pulling the fabric nice and taut. I used a pair of needle nose pliers to help me get this hoop nice and tightly closed. Then I use the pinking shears to cut off more excess fabric. While the rectangle of fabric was handy for transferring the pattern, too much excess fabric while stitching can get in your way. For those who are new to embroidery, you do want to leave enough excess fabric that you can tug on the fabric. It will loosen as you work and you'll need to make it nice and taut again. Before I begin stitching, I always plan out what colors of floss I'll use where and what type of stitch I'll probably use. So here you can see me planning that out. I did end up adding one more color of green floss than you see here to give the leaves more depth. I like to use this embroidery stand. It holds your hoop for you and offers a nice little place to keep your scissors and the floss color you are working with, or scraps of floss to throw out later. After adding the hoop to the stand, I add my needle minder and pick out the embroidery needle I'll be using. Now, the stitching part won't be a full-blown tutorial, I just want to take you through my process. I generally use 3 strands of floss, so that means I cut a length of the 6-stranded floss, then split the strands into 2 bunches of 3 strands. If you are new to embroidery, start at one end, then simply pull the 2 bunches apart from each other. Once I have a set of 3 strands, I thread my needle, then begin working on stitching. I find that you create much neater embroidery projects if you outline everything first. I'm using a split stitch to outline the flower petals, the flower buds, the medium and large leaves, and the butterfly wings. These elements will all have satin or long and short stitching. I leave the circles, the branches, the body and antenna of the butterfly, and the small leaves alone for now. I'm doing some special stitches that don't require outlining. I'll have some links to some tutorials that show different stitches in the description box, so if you're new to embroidery, I highly recommend watching those so you can learn the different stitches and then practice on some scrap fabric first. But essentially, to start a split stitch, create 1 stitch by coming up through the fabric and then back down. When you come back up through the fabric to create another stitch, come up through the middle of the first stitch. Then bring the needle back down a little bit past the end of the first stitch. Then keep repeating this, essentially splitting the previous stitch in half. After I've completed outlining all of the elements that will get satin or long and short stitching, I go back in with a heat erasable pen to mark where I want to add pad. Pad is satin stitching that creates bulk and dimension to your project. Pad gets covered up by your final decorative stitches, but that doesn't mean you can be messy about it. The neater you are with your pad, the nicer your final stitches will come out. You can see that I've added some plus signs to some of the marked pad, and this just indicates I want 2 layers of pad stitching here. I also make some marks about the direction I want the final decorative stitching to go. And now is the long process of adding pad stitching. To keep my stitches even and neat, I break the area into chunks by creating a few stitches that are further spaced apart. Then I go back in and fill up the entire area. Now for pad, you also want the final layer of pad to be going in the opposite direction of your decorative stitching. So because I want 2 layers of pad for this section, I start by stitching in the same direction as the final decorative stitching. Then my second layer pad stitching goes perpendicular to the first. This stitching is now opposite of the final stitching that will go on this petal of the magnolia. But we'll get to that final decorative stitching later. I like to work on all the pad first. Here you can see me adding some pad to half of a leaf. Then I also add a bullion stitch along the edge of the leaf. You can see I also did this on many of the petals of the flowers. Bullion stitching can be decorative, but in this case, it's going to add a lot of bulk quickly and is great for making leaves and petals look more curled and curved. To do a bullion stitch, bring your needle up through the fabric. Then push your needle down through the fabric several lengths away from where you brought the needle up. But don't pull the thread all the way through. Leave a long working loop. Then bring the needle back to where you first entered through the fabric for this stitch, pushing the needle halfway through the fabric. Loop the working end of the thread around your needle, pushing it down as you go. Add enough loops that it will fill the length between where your needle came up and where it went down. When you've got enough loops, hold on to them and then pull the needle all the way through. Once the needle on floss is all the way through, push it down through the fabric at the end of the bullion to tack it into place. This can be a tricky stitch, so I definitely recommend practicing it first. Now that the pad is all done, I work on the decorative stitching that will hide all this pad. I use a bit of a satin and long and short stitch hybrid for the flower petals. I want everything very organic, so I don't have a specific long-short pattern that I use. Essentially, I'm just adding texture to the petals with this stitch. As with the pad, you can see that in the larger areas, I do like to create a few stitches to help guide filling in the petal. I also stitch in a fishbone pattern on several of the petals. I think the combination of the fishbone and the long and short satin hybrid creates a more realistic look. And I realized that I would need a bit more definition between some of these petals, so I added a bit more bullion stitching along the edges of some of them. And I forgot to show the floss number I've been using for these petals, but it has been the lightest shade of pink that I chose. I'll let this play out a bit more for this third large magnolia. Next, I switch to the medium shade of pink floss and work on adding shading to the petals. You can see I've already finished the top two flowers, so this gives you an idea of what I'm doing with the last one. Based on sunlight and nature, this particular petal would be more shaded, so I'm filling in this one with the medium pink. Then I go over all the bullion stitched areas at the edges of the petals with a darker pink using a satin stitch. This creates a darker underside of the flower petals. I also add some shading to the inside of the petals, adding a few stitches of the medium pink, starting from the flower center and stitching out toward the petal tip. I'm also using this medium pink on the flower buds. I use a fishbone style stitch for many of these. Normally I'd finish working with this color before showing you the next bit, but I have to take this project on the go with me, so now let's move to the darkest pink. I add it to the petals to create more shading, adding a few stitches here and there. Again, starting from the center of the flower and stitching toward the petal tip. And for the large leaves, I use the darker green on the side with pad and bullion stitching, then the lighter green on the other side of the leaf. Again, I use the fishbone stitch. For the small leaves, I do a lazy daisy stitch. Now for the branches. I'm using a stem stitch and a brown floss for this. For the thicker part of the branch, I'm using a 3-strand floss doubled over, so I'm actually stitching with 6 strands. The stem stitch is a bit like the split stitch, but instead of splitting the stitch, you come up next to the previous stitch at about the halfway mark. This gives a twisted candy cane-like look that is really lovely for flower stems and branches because of all the texture. To make this branch look even more natural, I go from thick to thin. I add a second set of stem stitches and end this second line before I get to the end of the first one. For the thinnest part of the branches, I do a simple back stitch. Now to the butterfly. I use a simple satin stitch on the wings with 2 hues of blue. For the antenna, I used the darker blue and did a straight stitch. To get it to match the curve, I add a single stitch to tack it in place. Then I placed a French knot at the top of each antenna. The body was also with the darker blue floss, and I used a bullion stitch. Next was adding some French knots with the brown floss to the centers of the Magnolias. I did 3 loops around just to give them a bit more puff and volume. It's easier for French knots to catch on things and pull, so I always do this stitch toward the end. Finally, I work with the metallic thread, stitching a chain stitch along the circle. It's like the lazy daisy, but you keep the pattern going in a line rather than working around a center point. Metallic thread is much harder to work with as it can bend. It will also unravel at the cut end through your needle eye. Because of this, I highly recommend working with shorter lengths of thread. Now for the final bit of work on this piece. I removed the hoop from the stand and the fabric from the hoop. I used my sizzix heat tool to go over the piece and get rid of the heat erasable pen marks. Make sure to use the lower setting when going over and near the metallic threads. You can also use a light iron for this, but I like that the heat tool doesn't press the threads down, keeping all my hard work on making these flowers more lifelike. Once the lines are gone, stick the fabric back in the hoop and pull it taut. Do a running stitch with long stitches around the back of the hoop. We'll gather this in a minute. But before I do, I use my pinking shears to trim off additional excess fabric. Then pull on the running stitch to gather the fabric at the back of the hoop and tie it off in a finishing knot. To protect the back some more, you can add a circle of felt. I have some white wool felt and I trace the hoop out on it with a heat erasable pen. I cut just inside the marks and then get rid of the marks on the leftover fabric with my heat tool. I added the fabric inside the back of the hoop and I did use 4 tiny dots of hot glue just to tack it in place. And this is optional, but I always like to add a little chiffon ribbon to the tops of my hoops for a whimsical touch. And that's it. I hope you enjoyed seeing how you can use stamps to create your own embroidery patterns, and I hope that you also loved seeing some of my process for stitching. If you've never gotten into embroidery, I highly recommend it. It's very calming and so therapeutic to stab fabric with a needle over and over again. When I'm feeling down about the state of the world, it was so nice to have something to do with my hands that let me get out some of my frustrations in a healthy and creative way. And until next time, happy crafting.